Now to Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelenskyy has described further peace talks in Turkey with the current Russian delegation as pointless. Representatives from Ukraine and Russia are meeting in Istanbul to discuss terms for a ceasefire. The Ukrainian president told reporters that the Russian delegates aren't senior enough and called for a face-to-face meeting between himself and Russian President Vladimir Putin. His comments followed two significant strikes on Russia. Ukraine says it attacked a road and rail bridge linking Russia with the annexed Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. Kyiv also claimed responsibility for attacks on warplanes in Russia over the weekend. Let's get more on this from our special correspondent Mariel Muller in Kyiv and DW Washington correspondent Janelle Dumalaon. Welcome both. Let's start with you, Mariel. These surprise attacks that Ukraine say they launched, they must have provided quite a boost to Ukrainian morale.
Yeah, definitely. You can get a pretty good sense of the Ukrainian sentiment just by looking at social media over the past few days after the successful Operation Spider's Web over the weekend and also the most recent attack on the Kerch bridge that connects Russia with Crimea. People were celebrating online, and it gave them a huge morale boost, confidence and also motivation to keep pushing on. Also at the same time, military experts were warning here that people should also expect a retaliation coming from Russia in the next few days, so people should be taking air alerts seriously. And also Russia has said today that it has captured a village in the eastern region of Sumy, and it's just the latest of a string of gains that Russia has made in the past few weeks. So it is a development that is concerning, and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has warned last month already that Russia is amassing some 50,000 troops for a fresh offensive on Sumy, the capital of that region.
And Janelle Dumalaon in Washington, President Zelenskyy's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, has been in Washington today, meeting with the US Secretary of State. What's come out of that meeting?
So Andriy Yermak said that he and Marco Rubio discussed the situation on the front and the need for additional support for Ukraine's air defenses. He said that they also discussed the further course of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, the planned prisoner exchange between the two countries, and the need to return the hostages and children abducted by Russia. He also said, I emphasize that Ukraine has done everything possible to achieve peace, agrees to a ceasefire, but Russia is against it, so additional sanctions are needed. So we have a reiteration of positions here that are known, at least from the Ukrainian side, but we don't have the full details. But I do find it interesting that what is missing from this readout that we have so far is a mention of the US's reaction to these Ukrainian strikes. So that tells us that the administration is still probably following this line where it is avoiding either condemning or endorsing these strikes on Russia.
Okay. And Janelle, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group met at NATO HQ in Brussels today without the US Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth. So what can Ukraine and its allies expect from America, as it appears so reluctant to become too closely involved?
Yes, so that absence is notable. It's also the first time that the U.S. has been absent ever since that group was created by the U.S. By Hegseth's predecessor, Lloyd Austin. And you are right to say that Hegseth and Trump both have been threatening repeatedly to walk away from Ukraine in this war. Now, does that make it inevitable? No, it does not. There's also the school of thinking in Washington that walking away would further prolong the war and also make it look like the Trump administration's promises of deal making have failed. But the question is, what can allies and Ukraine expect concretely from the U.S.? That is hard to say. Even if you look at the topic of sanctions, Trump has not been very clear on whether he supports sanctions, even as his frustration with Putin grows. Yesterday, we heard from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt about it. She said that Trump views sanctions against Russia as a tool in his toolbox. He's willing to use sanctions if he needs them. And the Senate and Capitol Hill understand that the president is commander-in-chief. So that remains a very open question, just based on that answer that we got from Leavitt.
All right, well, let's put that question to Mariel in Kyiv. Given that US reluctance, Mariel, what is Ukraine still hoping it can get from the US?
Yeah, Ukraine obviously still hopes for a continuation of military support from the US, and especially and more pressingly to increase the pressure on Russia. Ahead of this meeting, Yermak, the chief of staff of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, told reporters here that Russia should feel painful and effective sanctions. He said, and I quote, "This is about energy, it is about oil, banks, sectors of the economy." So he said only this way Putin will actually recognize and realize that he has to stop and he has to take negotiations seriously. But also at the same time, Ukraine also hopes for more support from European countries. But it will be hard, according to military experts, for Europe to match what the US is providing to Ukraine, especially and most importantly, real-time American intelligence. So to know when is the strike happening, where is it going, what missile is coming, and to know where and how to strike. These are all capabilities that it will be hard for European countries also to provide.
Okay, thanks for that, Mariel. Mariel Muller, DW Special Correspondent in Kyiv, Washington Correspondent Janelle Dumalaon. Thank you both.
Ukraine says it has damaged the foundations of a road and rail bridge linking Russia with the annexed Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. Kyiv's SBU Secret Service released this footage showing a blast in the water. The Kerch Strait Bridge is a key access route for Russia to the peninsula, making it a prime target for Ukraine. Moscow annexed Crimea in 2014, and the bridge has been attacked several times during the war. Now, Russian officials say traffic across the bridge has now resumed. The explosions at the Kerch Bridge followed a major Ukrainian attack that destroyed several Russian warplanes. Swarms of Ukrainian drones hit multiple Russian air bases, some of them deep inside the country.
They launch Russian cruise missiles at Ukraine, Tu-22 and Tu-95 bombers, the latter also known as Bear, their NATO reporting name. Precisely these planes were destroyed by the Ukrainian drones. How many remains unclear. Ukraine speaks of 40 aircraft. That would be a third of all Russian long-range strategic bombers. Russian propaganda bloggers say this figure is greatly exaggerated.
There were 5 Tu-22 and 4 Tu-95 bombers destroyed, plus 1 Antonov transport plane, but these numbers can vary.
Independent military analysts suspect that slightly more aircraft were hit than Russian propaganda admits, and slightly fewer than Ukrainian officials claim.
According to the latest satellite images, 13 aircraft were either destroyed or severely damaged.
Developed in the 1950s in the Soviet Union, the propeller-powered Tu-95 is one of the oldest active military aircraft in the world. The bomber has been part of Russia's nuclear deterrent for decades. However, neither the Tu-95 nor the Tu-22 is produced today, and that means their loss cannot be compensated for. But besides the material damage, analysts say the Ukrainian drones have also caused enormous damage to morale in the Kremlin.
For Putin, it's important not only to have the moral high ground, pretending that this war has something to do with history and something to do with claims for traditional Russian territories, but also have the upper hand militarily. But what we are seeing right now is technological advancement of Ukraine using cheap materials. This is the damage to the prestige of the Russian army, of Russian military, of FSB, and of all Russian secret services.
The question now is how President Putin will react to this.
Marina Miron is a military analyst from King's College in London, and she joins us from Munich today. Marina, great to see you again. Now, Ukraine has managed, we heard it there, to launch 2 major attacks against Russian targets in recent days. Do you consider this a sign of increased Ukrainian capabilities?
Good afternoon. Well, what we have to understand here is the situation on the battlefield and the fact that the peace talks are taking place. 2 rounds have taken place now. So for Ukraine right now, it is necessary to find weaknesses in Russia that it can exploit. And one of those weaknesses coming to the Kerch Bridge, for instance, was the Black Sea Fleet. And we have seen that at the very beginning. Actually, it wasn't the Ukrainian Navy, it was the SBU operating those surface drones in order to force the Black Sea Fleet away. And so the Black Sea Fleet is now in Novorossiysk, and therefore Ukraine is good at exploiting this asymmetry, and same with the attack on the airfields. Again, a weakness has been found, and it has been difficult to find this weakness. This weakness has been found, and it has been exploited. And I think the most important thing here is a moral effect to show that every time the Ukrainian, specifically intelligence services, will be trying to be a step ahead, because you cannot protect physically everything with Russia having such a huge territory. And besides, the technologies change. So whatever protection systems the Russians had installed at those airfields couldn't jam those FPV drones that were used in that attack. So I think we will be seeing more and more, as far as it is possible and within the reach of Ukrainian intelligence services, of these kinds of operations. Maybe the material damage is not that great, but it will be a psychological damage to the morale.
Yeah, and it did expose, you said it, their major vulnerabilities. Was this a massive intelligence failure then? Because it does seem like Moscow did not see these attacks coming.
Well, that is a good question, because in order to be able to say, it certainly looks like the FSB overslept this. But then the question is, how many other attempts have been made elsewhere? What is the ratio of failed attempts to a successful attempt? And we will probably never know that. Because if nothing happens, nothing is being reported. And as a normal citizen, you wouldn't be paying attention. You only pay attention if something hits the news. And this is exactly the case here. We don't know how many other operations might have been called off due to unfavorable circumstances, change in plans, and so on and so forth. So maybe Russian counterintelligence did manage to prevent operations, but unfortunately, this is something that I cannot speak to, because this is not the kind of information that you will ever have in the public domain, and I don't even think it would be released within Russia. That being said, of course, the FSB will have to answer questions. The military will have to answer questions, specifically the soldier who filmed this attack. And that video was then shared and reshared, and these kinds of things will most likely be prevented in the future, not just upping the defenses, but specifically ensuring that this kind of footage doesn't get into the information sphere.
Especially with the Kerch Bridge being such a symbolic target. I want to look at the attack on the warplanes. How much of a military blow is this to Russia, or is it really all just psychological?
From my point of view, it is the major blow is psychological blow. It's the blow, as we just discussed, partially to the intelligence services, because the questions will be asked to the military. It will prompt questions to rethink, what do you do with a strategic bomber fleet? How do you protect it? How do you replace certain things? But as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned, I don't see this having a major impact on what is going on, except for a psychological impact, which can go either way. It can either increase the support for the ongoing war, or quite the opposite, call into question the ability of the Kremlin to protect its most prized assets, military assets, strategic bombers, one part of Russia's nuclear trade. So it will be more psychological. Besides, we have heard that a conservative estimate was 13 aircraft have been destroyed. So Russia still has enough to use in Ukraine if it wants to.
At the beginning of our chat, you mentioned the 2 rounds of peace negotiations that have already taken place. There is a widespread sense that Vladimir Putin is not very serious about these talks. Is this pressure that Ukraine is exerting right now the kind of pressure that could force Vladimir Putin to engage in more serious peace negotiations, you think?
I don't think it will have any sort of effect on the parallel peace negotiations. I think the Russians are very careful to separate the two things because there has been certain expectations that after this attack on the airfields, the negotiations might be called off. And they were not called off, they were not terminated early, and I think both sides will be striving to show the United States that they are capable of talking to each other, even if the result is merely humanitarian, such as prisoner exchange. But each side will try to show to the United States or to win international supporters. For Russia, it will be important to have Trump at least neutral, if not taking the Russian position. And for President Zelenskyy, it will be, of course, important that the United States continues and increases military aid to Ukraine. So I think these negotiations are aimed at that. And that's where you have kind of diplomacy at play. And of course, these attacks are designed to psychologically influence the Russian side. But so far, we haven't seen an effect to that end.
That was military analyst Marina Miron. Grateful as always for your input. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.